The Blue Hands is a spooky legend for kids about a brave young man who meets a stranger on All Saints' Eve. In the little town of Huelamo in Spain, it was the night of All Saints. This was the dreaded eve when the paths of the dead and the living are said to cross. On this night, it is believed that the dead rise from their graves and walk the earth while mortal men pay their respects by keeping on their guard and remaining indoors. Instead of being at home, a brash young man named Jose Manuel was walking around the town. He had no fear of ghosts and scoffed at the old legends, saying that it was all a hoax and men were foolish to be afraid of things they had never seen. Jose and his friend Esteban were rivals in love, both vying for the affections of one pretty young girl in their village. On the night of All Saints, Jose made a bet with his friend. They agreed that if Jose was brave enough to stay out all night and not return to his house before dawn, Esteban would have to give up his pursuit of the girl. Jose was determined to win the bet, and his bravery and recklessness knew no bounds. At about 4 a.m., he was walking through the town square when he spotted a man lurking in the shadows. The stranger was pale and thin and dressed in a long, stylish black coat. His collars were drawn up around his face, obscuring his features. As Jose Manuel passed by, the stranger called out to him in a very polite voice and asked if he knew the way to La Serna. The night was quiet and Jose was bored, so he told the man that the town he was looking for was not very far from Huelamo and offered to show him the way. The stranger readily agreed, and together, they set off on their journey. They traversed the empty streets of the town, passed through the deserted lanes until they finally found themselves on the desolate, rocky road that led to La Serna. Throughout all this time, the stranger did not utter a word, and Jose Manuel was becoming a little uneasy. He did not dare to break the ominous silence that hung over them. The man exuded an odd, unearthly presence. As they were passing by a place known as the Alto de la Horca, Jose happened to steal a glance at his companion and was shocked by what he saw. For a moment, he thought his eyes must be deceiving him. Underneath the man's cloak, it seemed as if he could make out a very faint blue flame covering his fingers. "That's impossible," he told himself. "It must be some kind of strange optical illusion caused by the light of the moon. Or perhaps exhaustion is taking its toll on my mind and causing me to imagine things." Despite his uneasiness, he refocused his attention on the dark road. They continued to walk, following the path in mutual silence. However, Jose couldn't help but steal another glance at his companion. When he did, he realized with horror that the blue flames were now engulfing the man's hands and feet. Instead of disappearing, the effect had been increasing, and there seemed to be no rational explanation for it. For the first time in his life, Jose was experiencing real fear. His mind began working overtime in order to come up with a plan. He stopped suddenly and told the stranger that he needed to go to the toilet and couldn't hold it any longer. "Wait here," said Jose, trying to hide his terror. "I'll be back in a moment." "Very well," replied the stranger in a commanding voice. "I will allow it, but do not take long. You had better be back before you hear 3 claps. I dislike waiting. Clap, 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 and no more." Jose ran behind a clump of bushes by the side of the road. There, he heard the first clap. Hidden by the darkness, he waited until the stranger wasn't looking and took off running. Dashing down the road at high speed, he didn't dare look back. In the distance, he heard a second clap. By the time he reached the village, he heard a third clap. Turning around, he realized that the stranger was hot on his heels. His feet were not moving, he was just gliding through the air and gaining quickly. The flaming blue hands were reaching out to grab him. Jose was so startled, he let out a scream and began to run even faster. When he reached his house, he ran inside and slammed the door behind him. Within seconds, he heard a loud bang as the malevolent entity collided with the door of his home. Exhausted and terrified, Jose Manuel dropped to the floor and listened as the thing outside began banging and scraping at the door. Then, he heard a growling voice say, "This time, your feet have saved you. Otherwise, I would have drunk your blood." After all was calm, lying on the floor, Jose fell into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, when the sun rose, Jose awoke to hear the laughter of children coming from the street. He wondered if what he had experienced the night before had all just been a nightmare. When he looked outside, he noticed 2 blue handprints seared into the wood of the front door. Never again would Jose Manuel leave his house for any reason. He became a shut-in and lived in fear that the man with blue hands would come back to drink his blood. He spent the rest of his days a virtual captive in his own home. Everyone thought he was crazy, and not one person ever believed his story. Blue Wine is a spooky story about a Chinese man who has an encounter with a demon. There were two Chinese men named Sung and Chuang who lived in the city of Peking. Sung was a historian and Chuang was a magistrate. They had been the best of friends for years and spent a great deal of time together, eating, drinking, and discussing Chinese history and politics. One night, the two men were indulging in a pleasant evening of conversation at the house of Chuang, eating delicacies that had been prepared by his servants and sipping warm wine from his cellar. One of the servants came in to interrupt them, and Chuang was called away on urgent business. As he was leaving, he told his friend to make himself at home until he returned. While Sung was waiting, he decided to pour himself a fresh cup of wine. No sooner had he done this than the cup suddenly vanished from sight. Suing couldn't believe his eyes. He searched all over the room, but couldn't find the missing wine glass. Baffled and a little annoyed, he poured himself a second cup. This time, as he watched in disbelief, a dark blue hand emerged from beneath the table and snatched the cup away. Jumping to his feet in fright, Suing managed to get out of the way just as an enormous blue demon emerged from under the table. It glared ferociously at Suing and flared its nostrils. Trembling, he cried out for help and two servants rushed into the room, but it was too late. By the time they got there, the blue demon had disappeared. When Chuang returned and heard what had happened, he laughed at his friend and dared him to spend the night in the very room. Not wanting to seem like a coward, Sung agreed to this, making sure, however, that he could sleep with his sword by his side. It was a very special sword, having once belonged to a great Tartar general. As soon as a couch had been prepared for him, Chuang said goodnight and took his leave. It was late autumn and outside the wind caused the leaves to rustle. A pale moon cast its eerie light through the window, and behind a silken green curtain a small oil lamp burned. The moonbeams and the lamplight did not disturb Sung, for he intended to remain awake. Nevertheless, by the time the hour of the rat approached, which is exactly midnight, his tongue began to dozen. Suddenly an empty wine cup fell clattering to the table, followed immediately by a second one. Ha! He thought, he's returning the empties. And then, an instant after the second cup appeared, a blue leg poked through the east window, followed by an arm, an ear, an eye, half a nose, and half a mouth. At the same time, through the west window, another arm, leg, eye, and ear appeared along with the other halves of the mouth and the nose. Silently they joined together in the middle of the room, forming a complete figure. As an icy blast of wind blew the curtain, the blue demon glared horribly at Sung and began to advance on him. Seizing his sword, Sung leaped up and slashed at the great blue figure, cutting deeply into one arm. Whirling about, the demon jumped out the window with Sung hard at his heels. Brandishing his sword resolutely, the determined man chased the demon until it ducked behind a cherry tree and disappeared. After making sure that it had really gone, Sung returned to the house and went back to bed. The next morning, while on the way to the room in which his friend and spent the night, Chuang becomes suddenly alarmed upon looking out into the garden and seeing a trail of blood leading from that very room. He was pleased beyond measure when he heard from his son's own lips what had happened during the night. As a precaution, Chuang ordered the cherry tree cut down and chopped to pieces, at which time he discovered that every chip of wood smelled of wine. Hawk is a story about a strange light on a marsh called a jack-o'-lantern. One night, a young man named Hawk was walking down the road with his friend. As they were passing by a long stretch of marshy land, they saw a strange light in the distance. "Who you reckon that is, walking out there on the marsh at this time of night?" asked Hawk. "I don't see nothing," said his friend. "Can't you see them?" asked Hawk. "There's a light bobbing up and down out there, like they're looking for something." "Don't look at it," said his friend. "That ain't no person. That's a jack-o'-lantern and you best leave it alone. You don't know what kind of danger it will lead you into if you follow it." "What's a jack-o'-lantern?" asked Hawk. "Jack-o'-lanterns are spirits," his friend replied. "They're evil spirits, the ghosts of sinful people who are caught between life and death. They weren't allowed into heaven and they can't get into hell, so their punishment is to wander for all eternity. They wander in the bad places where no one ever goes and on the bad nights when nobody is out. They entice you to follow them and they lead you off the right road." Hawk just laughed. "That's no ghost," he said. "There's somebody out there walking on the marsh, and I'm going to see who it is. If they gets a hold on you and you follow 'em, it don't lead you to no good. When you starts to follow, one mind will tell you alone and turn back, and another mind will tell you follow 'em, and you follow 'em. Don't be a fool," said his friend. "If they get a hold of you, they'll make you follow them, and once you follow them you won't be able to stop." "I'm not scared of any man," Hawk boasted. "I'm going out there and you can't stop me." "Don't say I didn't warn you," his friend shouted. But it was no use. Hawk was already making his way out onto the marsh. That night, Hawk didn't come home. His friends were worried, and when dawn broke, they went out to search for him. They found a trail of his footprints leading out onto the marsh. It looked like Hawk had been walking in circles, falling into holes and scrambling through the briar. They followed Hawk's footprints for miles, and eventually, they found him. It was a terrible sight. He was standing in mud up to his waist with his head reared back, and he was holding both hands out in front of him, as if he was trying to fend off something. His hair was white and his eyes were wide open, and there was a horrible grimace frozen on his face. They called out to him, but Hawk didn't seem to hear. When they reached out and grabbed him by the shoulder, he was icy cold and stiff and dead. The Mud Hole is a story about a young boy's encounter with the devil. Did you know that the devil has only one eye and it glows bright red? That's what he uses to get you to do his bidding. If he manages to fix that red eye on you, he'll hypnotize you and you'll be powerless to resist. I know because when I was a boy, the devil tried to tempt me into sin. Behind the barn on my father's farm, there was a mud hole. It was about 4 feet across and very deep. The funny thing about it was that, no matter how hot it got in the summer, the mud hole never dried up, and no matter how cold it got in the winter, it never froze over. All year long, it stayed the same, filled to the brim with thick, gooey mud, like quicksand. My father called it the Devil's Mud Hole. He said that the mud hole was so deep, it had no bottom. There was a tunnel that led all the way down to hell, and the devil lived down there. He told me that, when nobody was around, the devil would come crawling out of the hole and go about trying to tempt unsuspecting people into sin and trying to spread his evil. My father often told stories, so I never took him seriously. However, I was always scared of that mud hole. I used to walk around it every time I went out to play in the fields, and it always gave me the chills. One day, as I was walking past the mud hole, I noticed something strange. The mud was boiling and bubbling and frothing over, just like a pot on a red-hot stove. I had never seen it do anything like that before, so I stopped to take a look. All of a sudden, steam began to shoot out of the hole, and it kept boiling and bubbling faster and faster. Then, as I watched in horror, 2 big clawed hands emerged from the muck and something black and monstrous dragged itself out. It looked like a naked man, covered from head to toe in mud. His head was bald and he had horns like a goat, and instead of feet, he had big hooves like a cow. He had a forked tail that swished back and forth, and in his hand, he was clutching a pitchfork. When I looked at his face, I saw he had a long, hooked nose and a pointy beard, and in the middle of his forehead, there was one big glowing red eye. I knew who it was straight away. I didn't know what to do. I was frozen to the spot by fear, and I just stood there, staring in horror and shaking in my boots. He fixed his red eye on me and held my gaze. I couldn't look away. I felt like I was getting weak, and I was afraid I was going to faint. "Hello, boy," he said in a deep, booming voice. "I need you to do something for me. I want you to get your parish priest to take a drink of liquor. Did you know your parish priest used to be a terrible alcoholic? He gave up drinking 10 years ago, and ever since, he has led a good Christian life. If he takes one drink, I know he'll be a goner and will backslide into his old ways. So I need you to tempt him for me." I wanted to turn and run or scream out loud, but my head felt strange. It was as if I wasn't in control of my own body. I felt my mouth moving, and I heard myself say, "I will carry out your orders, Master." The next day was Sunday, and there was a picnic at the church. All of the people in town were there. I stole a pint of whiskey from my father's cupboard and took it along to the picnic. As the people were laying out the blankets and taking food out of the baskets, I went up to the parish priest and told him I had a problem and I needed to talk to him. I asked him to come over to the graveyard with me. When we were alone, standing among the tombstones, I pulled out the bottle of whiskey, uncorked it, and held it out to the priest. I was feeling really bad and my conscience was gnawing at me. I didn't want to do it, but I could still see the devil's glowing red eye floating around inside my head. When he saw the whiskey, the priest's eyes flashed wide. He stuck out his tongue and licked his lips. He kept his eyes glued on the bottle. "I haven't had a drink in 10 years, he said. "That's a long time to be thirsty, isn't it?" I told him it sure was. The priest grabbed the bottle out of my hand and started to raise it to his mouth. Just then, I suddenly felt in control of myself again. I drew back and with one hard slap, I knocked the bottle out of the priest's hand. It smashed against a tombstone and the whiskey went everywhere. The priest looked at me. I didn't say anything and he didn't say anything, but I knew he was glad I had broken the bottle. I got scared and ran away. That evening, I found myself at the mud hole again. It was boiling and bubbling and steaming, just like before. The devil came crawling out with mud dripping off him. His big red eye was glowing worse than ever and he was hopping mad. "Hello, boy," he growled. "You didn't carry out my orders, so now you are going to be punished. Pick up that axe over there." The devil fixed his big red eye on me and I couldn't control my body anymore. He made me pick up the axe and lay my hand out on the chopping block. Then he made me raise up the axe. There was nothing I could do to resist. I brought the axe crashing down and chopped off my little finger. Blood squirted everywhere and I let out a scream of pain. "That should teach you a lesson, boy," the devil said. "Next time it'll be something bigger and more important." I ran home and wrapped a bandage around my mutilated hand. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who to turn to. I couldn't tell my mother and father because I knew they'd think I was crazy with the heat or something. Finally, I made up my mind to go talk it over with old Martha. Everybody in town knew her. She was an old witch woman who lived on the hill and she knew the secrets of conjuring out evil spirits. That night, I went to old Martha's house on the other side of the ridge. She listened carefully to what I had to say and kept nodding her head. "You know there's one way to deal with devil and his big red eye," she said. "There's a charm in tobacco if you knows how to use it." Then she told me what to do to break the spell the devil put on me. She gave me a big lump of tobacco and told me to chew it. The tobacco tasted horrible, but I kept chewing and chewing. All that night, I chewed that tobacco until it was just a big brown ball of mush in my mouth. The next day, when I went out to the mud hole again, I was still chewing. The mud started boiling and bubbling and steaming and the devil came crawling out. Before he could turn his big red eye on me, I let him have it. I threw back my head and hawked a big loogie at him. The chewing tobacco hit him square in the eye. The devil let out a terrible howl, like a wildcat caught in a trap. He dropped his pitchfork and clapped both hands over his eye, twisting back and forth in pain. Then, quick as a flash, he jumped back into the mud hole. There was a loud sucking sound as he sank down into the mud and some big bubbles popped up as he disappeared. I picked up the pitchfork with my one good hand and carried it home. I've used it around the farm ever since. After that, I was never bothered by the devil again. The mud hole dried up and unless you knew where it had been, you wouldn't even be able to find the place. The Stuffed Dog is a story about a young boy who visits his grandmother and is creeped out by the dead pet she keeps in her library. There was a young boy named Theodore who was visiting his grandmother's house. He hated his grandmother, but his parents forced him to go. His grandfather had died recently and his grandmother was very lonely. She needed someone to keep her company. Theodore couldn't stand the old lady. She bored him with her endless talk, she constantly asked him to do chores, she insisted on giving him disgusting kisses on the cheek, and she smelled like pee. He also hated his grandmother's house. It was boring and there was never anything to do. The place was stuffed with old books and creepy statues. The beds were lumpy and uncomfortable. She didn't even have electricity and every room was lit by candles. The thing he hated most of all was the stuffed dog that his grandmother kept in the library. She said it was her husband's dog and that it had stood by him always. So when the dog died, she had it stuffed and placed it in her husband's favorite room, the library. Whenever Theodore saw the stuffed dog, it creeped him out. He couldn't stand the sight of it. The wretched thing made his skin crawl with its snarling, evil face, its beady glass eyes, and its mangy, greasy fur. That night, when his grandmother was going to bed, she wanted to light the candles in her room. She couldn't find any matches, so she asked Theodore to go downstairs find some. Theodore gritted his teeth and swallowed his anger. He was irritated by all the chores she asked him to do. He walked downstairs and went into the library. It was dark and he searched through the cupboards and drawers. Eventually, he found the matches. Just then, he thought he heard a strange sound. It sounded like a low growl. Theodore turned and looked at the stuffed dog in the corner. The dog stared back at him with glassy eyes. He hated that dog. It bugged him so much that he thought of a way to get back at it. He struck one of the matches and shoved it in the stuffed dog's face, burning off its whiskers. Theodore's grandmother heard a terrible scream. She ran downstairs and rushed into the library. Theodore lay sprawled on the ground, his eyes wide open and his face twisted in a look of terror. He was dead. She immediately called the police. Later, as the ambulance carried him off, she shook her head sadly and said, "He looks just like my husband did when he died." Unseen by anyone, in the darkness of the library, the stuffed dog sat very still and there was a trickle of blood dripping down from its mouth.